Hello, and welcome to week 3 of Intro to American Studies. I hope that your first week of classes has gone all right, and I hope that you are able to enjoy the snow a bit. This week, we are reading the introduction to Matthew Fry Jacobson's Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race. And this is a highly regarded book in the field of American studies, as well as a foundational book in a field called whiteness studies, which is the interdisciplinary study of whiteness. So just because something's in one interdisciplinary field doesn't mean that it can't also fall into the purview of many of them, and that's often the case. So the boundaries are not rigid. So I decided to start the course here because I think it's important to start any conversation about race with the understanding that whiteness and race in general has never been a scientifically definable quality. There is no gene for race. There is no test that can objectively determine your race. Race is an idea that the state and others use to control access to wealth and power. So ideas about race were invented by people and have changed over time. Some of you who are also taking courses in race and ethnicity may find this a familiar, even banal concept, but it's definitely not how we generally, I think by default, talk or think about race. So I want to draw your attention to that. And we'll see how, even if you are pretty familiar with the idea of race as an idea, that this book adds an interesting element to that, I think. So there are tons of books about this, and I chose this one because it spoke specifically to my own racial experience, and I wanted to show how this kind of scholarship is also personal and useful in the real world. So people ask me all the time, are Jewish people white? Because they know that I study this topic, and I usually say something like, well, yes and no. Firstly, there are plenty of Black, Brown, and Asian Jews. Jacobson's book does not deal with this intersectional understanding of Jewishness, right, where you have sort of the aspects of anti-Jewish discrimination that then intersect with aspects of anti-Black, anti-Brown, anti-Asian, right, discrimination. So that's a whole additional story that Jacobson is not addressing. Jacobson is talking about European immigrants, right? So he's talking about European descendant Jews who do have this sort of complex relationship to whiteness. So I say that it's complicated or even messy because when I interact with the cops, I'm treated as white. But if I roll up at a white nationalist rally, a neo-Nazi or Klan rally, well, I'm not going to be welcomed as white in that space, most generally, because anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish racism or discrimination is a key component of white supremacist ideology, which is why, the protesters at Charlottesville were holding signs that said Jews will not replace us. It's why you saw various Nazi iconography at the insurrection on the 6th. So anti-Semitism is a key component of white supremacist ideology, and yet we still see Jewish leaders participating in white supremacist violence here in the US and in Israel. And so what's going on here? So my experience is essentially of being both white and not white, depending on the circumstance. And Jacobson's book helped me to understand this seeming contradiction because he shows how European immigrants, including Eastern European Jews, but also folks from Ireland, Italy, and others, that these immigrants' relationship to whiteness has always been a sort of messy yes and no proposition, depending on the historical context and the needs of the nation at that time. And he basically tells a 3-part story. So first, he talks about the first naturalization laws in U.S. history. Naturalization laws dictate who can be naturalized as a citizen, so who can become a citizen. And this law said that only free white persons could become citizens. So right off the bat, boom, Americanness, right, has always been tied to whiteness. And who was considered white for the purposes of this law? Well, pretty much anyone from Europe, regardless of their language or religion. And, the key thing here, right, is that whether you were enslaved or free, right, Black people could not become citizens, Native American people could not become citizens. So this definitely, right, restricts, right, who is seen as a legitimate subject of the nation, as people who have European descent. And the vast majority of these immigrants at this time, right, in the first 100 years of the nation, were coming from Northern and Western Europe, and they were Protestant Christians. There was an increasing number of Irish Catholics that immigrate in the mid-19th century, and there was a significant amount of anti-Catholic and anti-Irish discrimination that comes basically from dynamics in England, between England and Ireland. And those dynamics definitely, right, were imported. And so Irish Catholics were often called dogs or savages or even the N-word in the 19th century, but they were still considered white enough for U.S. citizenship, right? So this expansive definition helped to further the colonization of the continent because the founders needed as many white bodies as possible to settle Native American land. So that's part one, where we have this expansive sense of just sort of free white persons can come to the nation to further colonize it, essentially. Then part two, 100 years later, by the late 19th century, so we're talking about 1890s-ish, the continent had been pretty much fully colonized and therefore stolen from various native nations, and immigration was therefore less necessary. And so the masses of immigrants that are still streaming into the country at this time also are no longer really from Northern and Western Europe. Now they're from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they were primarily Catholics and Jews and spoke languages other than English. So even the Irish, who experienced a lot of discrimination, they still did speak English, which was definitely an advantage. And so in the late 19th century, right, you have all these Catholics and Jews coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and Americans who are here already often are freaking out about how all of these immigrants were allegedly threatening American jobs and culture, which probably sounds familiar, right? The idea of, the threat of immigrants has always been, or has been a common theme in U.S. history, and a lot of it really takes similar forms to what we see today in the late 1800s. And so the part about immigrants stealing jobs part is not true, and we'll actually talk more about that lie in Unit 3. But the culture part was real. Immigrants were changing American culture and always have contributed to American culture. And so the traditional sort of English Protestant ruling class felt threatened, right? That American identity is being threatened by the incursion of all these different groups. So in this era, Jacobson argues that there's a fracturing of whiteness. So Jews, Italians, and others are seen as different inferior white races, similar to the dynamic with the Irish earlier on, but this becomes much more prominent kind of sense of fear and outrage in the late 1800s. And so, during this period, we see serious violence against many of these groups, including lynchings of Italian Americans and Jewish Americans, though, of course, nothing close to the number of Black Americans who were lynched, continue to be lynched. So this entire time, right, the violence and racism against Black Americans, against Indigenous people, is absolutely more more cruel and exploitative than even what these immigrant groups are experiencing. But nonetheless, Jacobson's point is that there is this fracturing even among white people, right, that creates sort of ideal and inferior notions of whiteness. And so by the 1920s, this sort of anti-immigrant racism ultimately leads to a dramatic restriction in the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe that are allowed into the country, period. So by the 1920s, the ideal American is not only white, but also Protestant, English-speaking, and from Northern and Western Europe. And I think it's important to understand that before these laws in the late 1800s, early 1900s, immigration is pretty much a free-for-all, again, because there's such a need for people to come and colonize and settle and work in this new nation. And so, all the debates that we continue to have around immigration reform and immigration restrictions, that all really just kind of is invented in the late 1800s. Initially, actually, to prevent Chinese immigration, which is a whole nother story, again, that we'll touch a little bit on in Unit 3. All right, so then in part 2 of Jacobson's story, right, we have the sort of fracturing of whiteness, the idea of superior and inferior white people. And so people in that inferior category do experience significant amounts of violence and discrimination. Again, although nothing compared to the sorts of violence and discrimination that people racialized as not white are experiencing at the same time. Then part 3 of Jacobson's story is after World War II. So we have the victory over the German Nazis, and this makes explicit racism, particularly against Jews, very unpopular. Plus, the civil rights movement is successfully calling out anti-blackness, calling attention to the black-white divide. And so in this era, after World War II, Jacobson argues that whiteness is being reconsolidated. And so all those inferior white races from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, are by the 1960s more or less benefiting from the same kinds of access to education and jobs and housing as all quote-unquote white people. And they're also being called out for the ways in which they participate in anti-blackness. And so here is where the story gets us to where we're at today, where you get this very common defensive response of, I'm not white, I'm Italian. I'm not white, I'm Irish. I'm not white, I'm Jewish. Because if I'm not white, then I'm not responsible for addressing anti-blackness, right? I'm not a part of the racism problem if I'm not white. And so this argument has been used very effectively against all sorts of racial justice policies and proposals, and it's still being used to oppose demands for racial justice. And so this is why Jacobson's 3-part story is so important, right? The history, the change over time. Because essentially what the descendants of many European immigrants are doing is that when they're called out for their participation in anti-Black racism, their defensive response is to highlight the second part of the story, right? The part where their ancestors were discriminated against, right? As Catholics, as Jews, etc. And then they skip the first part and the third part, which is where their ancestors benefited from their whiteness, right? So by just cherry picking like this one era in U.S. history, then the descendants of many of these folks use that to argue that no, they're the victim of discrimination in the United States. They're not the perpetrators. So to me, this is useful because I often hear things from Jewish peers like, my grandparents were discriminated against and they didn't need any special government support to succeed, so what are Black people complaining about? And now that I've read this book, my answer is, well, yes, our grandparents were discriminated against, and that did make their lives difficult, but they did have special government support. Their whiteness allowed them access to citizenship, often jobs and land, and after World War II, access to public benefits and education and housing that were not granted to people racialized as not white. And so activists of color are simply saying that they deserve the same government support that our European grandparents had. So that's how this book challenged and expanded my understanding of America. It helped me to understand my own complex racial experience and identity. It helped me to understand how the very real history of discrimination against inferior white groups has been used in simplistic ways to oppose movements for racial justice. And it also helped me deepen my research because when I'm researching Jews historically, now I understand that I can't just take my experience in 2020 and project it backwards on my ancestors. I need to look carefully into how they experienced their race in their specific place and time. So Jacobson changed not only how I see my own relationship to race and Americanness, but also how I carry out my research on race historically. And I hope you got something out of it too. So, Sunday, your reflection is due as usual. Make sure when you're making connections to popular media and culture that you're keeping in mind Jacobson's focus on immigrants, right? So not just anything related to race or white people, but things about race and immigrants, right, is really the connection that Jacobson is making. So as an example, I found these shirts for sale on Amazon that said Italian Lives Matter, and they were being used as a critique of the Black Lives Matter movement. So Jacobson's book helps me make sense of that because, again, this is an example of how people of Italian descent might use, right, their own history of discrimination in this country as a reason to object, right, to the demands of Black Americans for equal rights and justice. So that's just an example. So again, when you're looking for your connection to popular media and culture, you're looking for things that explore the relationship between race and immigration. And, you know, there are probably some really interesting parallels to be drawn nowadays to immigrants from other parts of the world beyond Europe, from Latin America, from Asia, perhaps, you know, again, these things evolve and change, right? And so some of the racial dynamics are undoubtedly different today than even they were in the sort of last part of Jacobson's argument. And I'm excited to see what you come up with. So I will, with that said, I hope you have a good week. I look forward to reading your reflections, and I will see you next time.